Hello everyone, my name is Kylie Clark and I am a third-year Communication Studies major at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I also conducted this research with two other Communication Studies majors, Brooke Lyon and Tina Reynolds, who unfortunately could not be here today. But I will be presenting our research entitled What Underlies Awkward Silence? Testing the impact of duration of conversational silences and level of interpersonal familiarity on perceived awkwardness. So we'll go ahead and go over our agenda for the day. So I will begin with an introduction to our study, including a brief literature review. I will then move into our study design, after which I will discuss our results, followed by a discussion including limitations and directions for future research. So we began our study with an observation, and this was that silence is perceived as awkward in the United States. Specifically, phrases like awkward silence reflect this, or someone leaving a conversation with a lot of silence saying, wow, that was so awkward. In addition, education values verbal participation and facilitation. This was reflected through things like a participation grade in a class. But why do we think this? Silence is not inherently awkward. In fact, in many situations, silence doesn't feel awkward at all. Specifically, we wanted to know why silence is perceived as awkward in interpersonal interactions, which I will also be referring to as dyadic interactions throughout this presentation, and that's any interaction between two people. So we looked to the research, and what we found is that silence is the lack of verbal communication, not the lack of communication. So there are many forms of silence, such as lack of facial expressions or lack of kinesic movement and expression, but specifically for our research, silence is the lack of verbal communication. In addition, silence is associated with communication incompetence. So if a communicator in an interaction is unable to fill long periods of silence or does not seem to have a lot of dialogue which they're contributing to the conversation, they will be viewed as their fellow communicator as an incompetent person in that regard. Also, silence is unlikely to meet esteem needs. So if somebody is unable to fill silence in a conversation, they will leave the conversation feeling negatively about it and therefore will have lower self-esteem. We also looked to one specific theory in our research, and this was interpersonal adaptation theory. And what this theory tells us is that humans have an innate pressure to find synchrony within interactions. This also governs human behavior, as well as things such as the need to fulfill social norms, to meet the context of the conversation, and to have their needs fulfilled by the conversation itself. Therefore, conversational incongruence can lead to negative feelings because people do not leave the conversation feeling good about the interaction that they've had when silence has occurred. And this means that their needs and desires were not met by an interaction. Based on all of this, we developed a goal. And this was to examine whether the type of relationship and duration of silence impact whether silence is perceived as awkward in interpersonal interactions. Based on this, we developed three hypotheses. First, we hypothesized that familiarity impacts the level of awkwardness perceived in a conversation, such that higher familiarity will lead to less awkwardness, while lower familiarity will lead to more awkwardness. Second, we hypothesized that duration impacts the level of awkwardness perceived, such that a longer duration of silence will lead to a higher perception of awkwardness in the conversation. And based on these two hypotheses, we created a third hypothesis, which tested for an interaction effect. And we hypothesized that lower familiarity and longer duration, when combined, would lead to more awkwardness than either or both variables acting separately. So now that I've introduced our study, I'll go ahead and move into study design. So we followed a post-test only experimental design through which we recruited 154 university students and distributed an online questionnaire. Our gender was very skewed, with 78.6% of participants being female, and the average age, as expected for a college population, was 21.73 years. So our first step in conducting our study was to administer our stimulus materials. So participants were assigned to one of 4 videos, and instructions were provided telling the participants to watch the video and to answer the following questions, as well as to wear headphones if necessary to eliminate distractions. So our first condition, short familiar, subjects viewed 2 best friends engaging in conversation with 4 seconds of silence. And this would be the condition that we would expect would be viewed as the least awkward. In the second condition, short unfamiliar, subjects viewed 2 acquaintances engaging in conversation with 4 seconds of silence. Third, long familiar, demonstrated 2 best friends engaging in conversation with 8 seconds of silence. And last, in long unfamiliar, subjects viewed two acquaintances engaging in conversation with 8 seconds of silence. And this is the interaction that we would hypothesize would be the most awkward. So our second step was to conduct a manipulation check in order to assure that our manipulations of the independent variables were perceived. So for level familiarity, we asked, the people in the video are from unfamiliar to familiar. And this manipulation was perceived, as you can see from our p-value, and the unfamiliar had a significantly lower mean than the familiar condition. For duration of silence, we asked, the length of silence in this interaction was from very brief to very long. And as you can see based on our p-value, this manipulation was also perceived, with short duration having a significantly lower mean than long duration. So since our manipulations were perceived, we're able to move into a discussion of the post-test. And we had 7 measures of perceived awkwardness using a semantic differential scale. So here you can see all 7 questions that were asked just to give you an idea, but I'm going to go ahead and point your attention to the first 2 questions to assess some examples. So we asked, the amount of silence in the video was from abnormal to normal, and the interaction made me feel from uncomfortable to comfortable. Something I want to point out here is that the way that our scale was designed was such that the most awkward was the lowest number and the least awkward was the highest number. So as you're viewing our results throughout the rest of this presentation, just keep in mind that the lower the number, the more awkward subjects perceive the silence as. And this scale had high reliability, as you can see based on our Cronbach's alpha. So now that I have detailed our study design, I'll move into a discussion of our results. So our first hypothesis was that higher familiarity would lead to less awkwardness. So in order to test this, we performed a t-test, and we actually found that the unfamiliar condition was viewed as less awkward than the familiar condition. So the interaction between 2 best friends was viewed as more awkward than the interaction between 2 strangers with the same amount of silence. And differences were statistically significant, as you can see from our p-value. Therefore, for hypothesis 1, the reverse of our hypothesis was supported. Our second hypothesis was that longer duration leads to more awkwardness. So we also performed a t-test in order to test this hypothesis, and we found, as expected, that the long condition was perceived as more awkward than the short condition, and differences were once again statistically significant, as you can see from our p-value. So for hypothesis 2, this hypothesis was supported. Our third hypothesis tested for an interaction effect between level familiarity and duration. So we predicted that lower familiarity and longer duration would be perceived as more awkward. So in order to test this, we performed a 2-way ANOVA in order to test for the interaction. And while we did find a main effect for familiarity and a main effect for duration, we did not find any significant interaction, as you can see based on our extremely high p-value. So hypothesis 3 was not supported. I will now move into a discussion of our results. So overall, what we found is that silence is perceived as more awkward amongst friends than acquaintances, at least in the context of our study. In addition, longer lengths of silence are perceived as more awkward than shorter lengths of silence. And last, the 2 variables function independently, meaning that there's no interaction effect between the 2. So, although a lot of the findings were contrary to our hypotheses, interpersonal adaptation theory can still be applied to our results. So, as the theory states, individuals have expectations and needs with which they enter conversations, and they need these conversations and interactions to fulfill their needs in order to leave the conversation feeling positive and feeling as if their needs have been fulfilled. So, these needs are more often fulfilled by friends than acquaintances because our interactions with friends tend to go deeper, to actually feel beneficial to ourselves, and to really get at a different level of friendship than we would expect from a conversation with an acquaintance. Therefore, silence is more threatening in close friendships because we need them to fulfill our needs, while we have very low expectations for an interaction with an acquaintance. I will now move into a couple of limitations of our study and some directions for future research. So our study had 2 main limitations. First, it was extremely demographically skewed. As I said, 78.6% of our participants were female, and all 3 researchers were communication studies majors, and at Cal Poly that is a highly female major, so we were not particularly surprised by these results, but there's certainly something to take into account when looking at our results and probably introduced a confounding variable to the study. In addition, 80.5% of participants were white, which unfortunately is very reflective of Cal Poly's population. And second, the embodiment of the roles by the actors may have influenced subjects. So we had a qualitative section at the end of our questionnaire in which participants could give any comments or questions that they had about the study in order for us to be sure to take into account any confounding variables that we may not have been aware of. And what a lot of participants indicated was that they felt like the actor on the right was very awkward, while the actor on the left was not awkward at all. So because of this, they were a little unsure of how to answer the questionnaire. Luckily, most of them indicated that they did still respond based on the interaction as a whole, so we do not feel that this is a strong confounding variable in our study, but it's certainly something to take into consideration. Next, some directions for future research. So research could examine how silence is perceived by members of a dyad rather than people external to the dyad. So the nature of our study was an individual viewing two people interacting in an interaction with silence and seeing how they perceive that interaction from the outside. However, this is extremely different from how we interact every day, and we were not able to get at the heart of how a person might actually feel during an interaction with somebody in which there was a lot of silence, and how awkward they might really feel about that. So, for example, a study could have an individual converse with a confederate who introduces silence into the conversation purposefully, and then after the interaction, we can have the subject report on the perceived communication competence of the individual, as well as the level of perceived awkwardness of the conversation as a whole. Second, further investigation could be looked into of the role of social needs and expectations. So while we did apply interpersonal adaptation theory to our study, it was not looking very specifically at social needs and expectations and the role that those were playing in the interaction itself. So it could be interesting to look at this even outside of the context of silence, just as awkwardness as a whole, or different contexts in which this could end up playing a part. So in conclusion, silence is perceived as more awkward amongst friends than acquaintances, and in longer lengths and in shorter lengths, and there is no interaction effect between the two variables. This can be explained by interpersonal adaptation theory, which states that we have needs and expectations which we need conversations to fulfill. And future research could explore the perception of silence from within a dyadic interaction and the impact of social needs and expectations on how we perceive conversational differences.